Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to look at Genesis chapter 27, which is a continuation of the story that we started a couple of weeks ago about Jacob and his twin brother Esau. And if you will remember, they're twin brothers, but they really weren't getting along very well. And it almost seems like even while they were inside the womb, the Bible says that they were like fighting with each other even before they were born. And what we're going to find out today is that struggle continues this next part of their story. So we find it, as I said, in Genesis 27. And we'll get started by just reading the first few verses. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son, here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man, and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me." And then he was going to ask him to prepare the special dinner that he loved, whatever, I don't know if he was shooting deer or whatever it was he would bring back. But if you remember, I think one thing we need to remember is that there was this family dynamic where Isaac loved Esau, because Esau was the brave hunter, real He-Man type of guy. And Rebecca, Isaac's wife Rebecca, loved Jacob. So that's never a formula for success in a family. But we do have to remember that. We have to keep that in mind, because that whole dynamic sort of comes into play with this whole family, this whole story that we're going to be looking at. Now, if you will remember, the first thing that happened was that Jacob had kind of swindled his brother Esau out of his birthright. And there's actually a couple of terms here that we're going to be dealing with. One is birthright, and the other is blessing. And these are two things that a son would receive from the father, and they're not the same. They're not exactly the same thing. Now, the birthright would be like an inheritance, just like today, when, a parent dies and they might leave an inheritance to their children, everything that they owned, in the physical world. That would be what the birthright was equivalent to. The blessing would be the next thing on the list. The birthright was already determined, and Esau gave up his right to the birthright, which simply meant in that custom, in that day, that the oldest son, the one who received the birthright, would get a double portion of the inheritance. Plus, he would be acknowledged as the one that would take over the leadership within the family. So it's kind of a big deal. And now we're getting to the point where, as it said, Isaac his eyesight is failing. He can't see very well, and he's not sure how much longer he's going to have to live. So this would be the time in a person's life when they would think about giving their blessing to their children. And a blessing is different than a birthright. Birthright is more technical. You get this much money and it's kind of cut and dried. A blessing is a little more, spiritual in nature. And it's like a prophetic or spiritual invocation. It's like something a father says to their son. And from the mouth of a godly man, such as Isaac, it would have to be in line with what God foresaw for this person. So a blessing was still a really, really big deal. Now, what happens next? Just to give you a little hint, as Isaac is talking about this with Esau, and he tells him, go out and shoot an animal and bring him back and make my favorite meal. Somebody's outside listening. And who is that? Well, it's Rebecca. It's Isaac's wife, Rebecca. And remembering the family dynamics, now she's really concerned about Jacob. And she really feels that Jacob is the one that should be receiving, all of the inheritance and blessing. And so she comes up with a plan. And, it's not I can't say it's the most honest plan in the world, and it probably will raise some questions about what are these people doing in the Bible when they're coming up with all these conniving plans. Well, what was the plan that she came up with? Verse 8. Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. And then take it to your father to eat so that he may give you his blessing before he dies. This is kind of interesting. I mean, she's coming up with this plan, this deceptive plan to make Isaac think he's blessing Esau, which is what he would intend. But in reality, he's going to give the blessing to Jacob. And, it's a pretty elaborate plan. And, her concern for her son, this is the son that she loves. There are other places in the Bible where similar things have happened. When you come down to the time of David, and he's just like Isaac is really old here and he's ready to die. David is ready to die. Now the kingdom had been promised to Solomon. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of Solomon, and his wisdom and Solomon's gold and all this stuff. But when it actually came to the time when David was just about to die, one of his other sons took the throne. He went out and rented a crown, I guess. I don't know. He put a crown on his head and he declared himself to be the king. And this is when Bathsheba, who was David's wife and who was Solomon's mother, steps in and, goes to bat for her son. And she goes to David and she says, Solomon is the one that you promised the kingdom to. So some interesting similarities between those two situations. But sometimes, maybe this is a principle, I think sometimes women have a little more clear spiritual perspective than the men do. And maybe that's what was going on here. Well, anyway, let's continue this exciting story. In verse 11, Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "But my brother Esau is a hairy man, and while I have smooth skin, what if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." His mother said to him, "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." So she's really pushing on this plan. And Jacob himself is a little bit nervous because he said, how are we going to pull this off? And we know that Jacob and Esau were totally different people. They were identical twins, but they weren't identical twins. I guess you could say they were fraternal twins because they look so much different in their personalities, and even I would say their spirituality was different. So Jacob is right in wondering, how in the world are we going to pull this off? Because all he has to do, I know he doesn't see very well anymore, but all he has to do is just, feel my arm and he would know that this isn't the right kid. But Rebekah just pushes him along and says, "Don't worry about it. If you're caught, I'll take all the responsibility for this." So they put their plan into effect. He went and he killed a couple of goats. I was wondering if maybe a young goat would taste like wild game. I'm not real sure. But one thing I suspect is that Esau wasn't the one that knew how to cook, this favorite meal that Isaac was asking for. I think probably it was Rebekah who knew the secret recipe. So she had a little bit of an advantage here. So she comes up with this plan to further trick Isaac, and she puts a piece of goat skin on his back so that if Isaac feels him, then he'll think that this is my hairy son and not my non-hairy son. I mean, this is getting kind of strange here, and I guess at this point, this is in the Bible. These are Bible people that we respect, and they're pulling off all these shenanigans. This deception, these outright lies. What is that all about? And I think there's a few ways to answer this. And one is that we simply have to remember, generally speaking, that God uses people. And, we still have this sinful nature. And we also mentioned the fact before that by this time, they were a long way from receiving God's law. The 10 Commandments, and thou shalt not do this and that. So it wasn't really ingrained in their minds as much as it would have been later in the history of Israel. So it was, kind of a wild west when it came to morals in that day and age. And, they were looking at things from a different perspective, I think. And I really do think that there was a spiritual quality to what was going on here as well. It was like a spiritual battle, because I think God knew who he wanted to be the heir of not just the wealth that Isaac had, but the promises that God had given to Abraham and who got passed down to Isaac, and who would be the next one in line to receive those promises. And well, anyway, they follow through with this plan, and then we read what happens when they try to pull this off in verses 18 to 20. He went to his father and said, "My father?" "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau." Lie number 1. "Your firstborn." "I have done as you told me." Lie number 2. "Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac asked his son, "How did you find it so quickly?" "Oh, the Lord your God gave me success." Lie number 4? I think it is. So now we have the plan was carried out. It was put into effect. And Jacob just outright lies to his father. We understand why he was doing it. We kind of get a sense of, how important this was, but still, it just seems so strange. Well, let's continue on and see what happens next. So Jacob went close to his father. This is verse 22. Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. And he asked him one more time, "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," he replied. And that kind of is the end of all the lies that he tells. What was that, like 5 different lies? Things that he lied about in order to pull this thing off, this deception. The things, they followed through with their plan, as we said, and Rebecca had cooked this meal. They brought it to Isaac, and it's interesting that he said that the smell of my son is like the smell of a field, and how when you can't see, they say that sometimes smells will bring back memories, and so this was all part of the deception. I don't know exactly how Jacob was able to get himself to smell like the field, but anyway, the whole deception worked, and it's just kind of interesting to see how that comes about. The end result, and this is really what Jacob and Rebekah were hoping for, is that Isaac then, being fooled, passes on, gives his blessing to Jacob, thinking that he is Esau. This is almost like one of those soap operas, what do you call them, soap operas they used to have on TV. You have all these plots going on, and this, like it's this incredible story of deception. But he does give him his blessing, and here is the blessing that he gives him in verses 28 and 29. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's riches, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you, and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." So this is the blessing that that Isaac is giving to his son Jacob, thinking that it's Esau. And it's interesting that all the different things that this includes. It talks about wealth, may heaven's dew fall upon the abundance of grain and all that stuff. Talks about power, that nations shall bow down before you. It talks about protection. There'll be a curse on anyone who tries to mess with you. And it's interesting that really that same type of blessing is what God extends to the nation of Israel in days to come. Blessed are those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. God says the same thing about the nation of Israel, which is interesting. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen next. Once Jacob receives this blessing and then kind of hightails it out of there. And what's going to happen next? Well, of course, Esau is going to come in after, being out in the field hunting. And he comes to his father and he, says, I've got the food for you. I brought this game. And this has got to be kind of confusing for Isaac now. What's going on here? What do you mean you brought food? So we read in verses 32 and 33. His father, Isaac, asked him, who are you? I am your son, he answered, your firstborn Esau. Isaac trembled violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him. And indeed, he will be blessed. So now Isaac he was a little suspicious. You remember all those questions he was asking? And now he comes to realize, and he's physically upset because it would have been in his heart to bless Esau. Remember, he was the one that Isaac preferred. Esau was the one that Isaac loved, and you would imagine it must have been very upsetting for him to realize that he too was deceived and that he gave his blessing to Jacob instead of Isaac. And it goes on to talk about how Esau was so upset and how he begs his father to give him a blessing as well. And he talks about the fact this is the second time that deceiver has tricked me. And his name, he's rightly named Jacob. The word Jacob was like deceiver or something like that. So Esau is lamenting the situation, having now fully understood what was going on. Then it even gets worse for Esau because Isaac has to tell him everything that he blessed. He recounts the blessing that he gave to Jacob, and then he has to give a word of blessing to Esau now. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because you would think, well, I'll just give you a good blessing too, but it doesn't work out that way. And we read that in Genesis, in verses 39 to 40, where Isaac says to him, your dwelling, and this is the blessing, I guess you could say, would be away from the earth's riches, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke off from your neck. And so Isaac's blessing for Esau is, it's like a curse. And why is that? Why did he do that? Why did he say that? Well, because I think we have to remember that he's speaking on behalf of God. There's another situation in the Bible that is similar to this. And there were two people, and this is later on in the history of Israel, after, this is like 500 years later. They were wandering around in the wilderness, the whole nation of Israel, and they were about to enter the promised land. And there was a king who kind of stood between them and the promised land, and he was very concerned because he saw millions of people, this powerful nation at his doorstep, and he wanted to do everything he could to, hurt them. And so he hires this prophet named Balaam. There's a whole story about Balaam and his donkey. Well, we'll get to that later, but what the point is, he was asking Balaam to give a curse to Israel, because he thought, wow, this guy's got special powers. He's a prophet, and all I got to do is pay him to, do some booga booga curse, and, that'll go against these Israelites who I really don't want to have around. But this was Balaam's response to Balak. Come, he said, and put a curse on Jacob for me. Come and denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced. So basically, Balaam, now he's an honest prophet, and he makes it clear, I can't be pronouncing curses on people if God intends to bless them. I mean, I guess I could, but it wouldn't mean anything, because I know that God's blessing is upon these people. And you might be wondering, you might have noticed in that he uses the word Jacob in referring to the nation of Israel. And I think that's just kind of an interesting thing. This was way after Jacob was, dead and gone, but he refers to Israel as Jacob. And so Jacob's name, I guess, lives on, just like God promised it would. So this is the principle, and I think this is why it wasn't just a matter of Isaac, dreaming up this wonderful blessing that he could give to his son, because he had to be truthful. And because he was a man of God. They had these people in the Old Testament called false prophets. And basically they pretended like they were prophets, but they were just telling the king and other people what they wanted to hear. And then a real prophet would come along and say, this guy is totally off the wall, and things are not as well off as you think they are, because these guys are just lying to you. So Balaam at least was not a false prophet, and he didn't try to pull the wool over God's eyes, because he couldn't, and he knew that. So he pronounced the truth, just as Isaac is pronouncing the truth to his son Esau. And that must have been a very difficult thing for him. Well, how does this whole thing end up? And this will be like the kind of a cliffhanger from the next time we follow through with this story. So it says in Genesis 27:41, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. Probably shouldn't be surprised, because Esau was really angry at his brother, having been tricked 2 times and having lost everything. I always think that, like in an athletic event, right now the Olympics are going on and we're watching all these skiers and stuff, and one guy is 1/100th of a second slower than another guy. And it's like, he was so close to getting everything, getting the gold medal. In a way, it was like that with Esau, because he had it all in his hands, but he gave it all up. Now, I know he was tricked in this last little episode here, but there was something about the nature of Esau compared to the nature of Jacob. And I think we'll kind of maybe wind things up by thinking about how God is looking at this whole thing. Well, the way the story ends, or where we will end the story now, is when Rebecca realizes, what's happening. She hears about this threat that Esau gives, that he's going to kill his brother, and she knows it's time for Jacob to hit the road and to flee. He has to get out of there, because she would know, according to that time and custom of that day, probably Esau would have had the right to kill his brother. The commandments hadn't been given yet, thou shalt not kill. So this is where the story ends, but I want to think about, what did we learn from it? Just like we always try to conclude. One is that, we're asking the question, these are some dishonest things that these people are doing. And how can God honor this? How can he turn his back on this? Well, I don't think it is that God ignores the dishonesty, and all this stuff, but that it's just who he is, that he works through sinful people. And you can look at just about everyone in the Bible and find where there was sin in their lives, where there were moral failures. We saw that with Noah, we saw it with Abraham, and we saw it with Isaac, earlier, and we're certainly seeing it with Jacob. But when you look at it through God's eyes, it's not just about that God is accomplishing his plan in spite of the fact, that he's working with sinful human people. I think another lesson that's very clear here is that your actions will bear fruit. And for Esau, the fact that he, as the Bible said, he despised his birthright. Like, he didn't think it was worth worrying about when he was younger until he gets older and he realized how foolish he was. But he paid the price for that youthful foolishness by losing his birthright, losing his right to the inheritance. And really, Isaac experienced the same thing, because Isaac, in all his deceit, cost him his place with his family. And now he is banished from his family, and it's all based on his actions. So be sure, as I don't know who said this initially, it's not in the Bible, be sure your sins will find you out. You can't be doing all this stuff without suffering the consequence. But the other interesting thing, and this is maybe where the bottom line where we'll end up, is that through the whole thing, God accomplished his purpose. And just as with Cain and Abel, remember, each of them brought an offering to the Lord, and the Lord accepted he accepted Abel's, but he didn't accept Cain's. And we don't really know exactly why, but we do know that God knew each of their hearts. And he knew there was something about Cain that was not right. And I think that when he's looking at both Jacob and Esau, and you can kind of sense that in just the way Esau does things, that he knows that the heart of Esau is not right. But even though he's a deceiver, the heart of Jacob is right. And that God had intended now to carry the promise that he gave to Abraham and to Isaac now down to Jacob. So the bottom line is, God is going to do what he's going to do. He will accomplish his purpose in spite of us. So I hope that this has been a blessing to you. Maybe it'll help us all think a little bit about the decisions that we make, and how they can result in good or bad. But this story gets even more interesting as we continue on, which is exactly what we're going to do next time on Gen Z Bible Class.